was on one of those peculiar oppressive evenings in late November, when the fog curls about the gas lamps of Baker Street like a living entity, that I first became aware of the peculiar nature of the case which was soon to dominate our lives. I had returned to our lodgings somewhat later than usual, weary from a day spent in my modest practice, only to find Holmes in his customary attitude of meticulous engagement kneeling beside his chemical reagents, peering through his microscope with the intensity of a man possessed, the gaslight throwing long shadows across the room. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "you appear to have weathered the day in a thoroughly pedestrian manner. Pray tell me, did you discover anything of note, or was it merely the usual parade of colics, coughs, and matrimonial squabbles?" I gave a faint smile, accustomed as I was to his sardonic wit. "Mostly the usual, Holmes," I replied, though one of my patients has taken to pacing the entire length of his sitting room while reciting poetry. "I fear he is on the brink of some romantic catastrophe." Holmes raised his head, his sharp grey eyes narrowing in thought. "Ah, yes. The human mind in its triviality is ever entertaining. Yet, my dear Watson, tonight promises something beyond the pedestrian." I could not immediately grasp his meaning, for the fog outside had begun to thicken, curling under the doorway and across the polished floorboards. Before I could inquire further, the bell at our lodgings rang with a sharpness that suggested urgency rather than ceremony. Holmes rose with a swift, almost feline grace and opened the door to reveal a gentleman whose appearance bespoke both distress and haste. He was tall and well-dressed, though the smudges upon his coat and the tremor in his hands betrayed his recent struggle with both the elements and agitation of the mind. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice quivering yet carefully modulated. "I have been advised insistently, might I add, seek your assistance. It is of the utmost urgency." Holmes motioned him inside without a word, his eyes flicking over the man with rapid calculation, noting the cut upon the gentleman's hand, the slight mud upon his boot, the anxious twitching of his left eyebrow. "Pray be seated, sir, and you may call me Holmes. I trust your urgency is genuine." The man nodded, swallowing audibly. "Indeed, my name is Arthur Pembroke. I fear I am at my wit's end. An incident has occurred, one so strange, so confounding, that Scotland Yard themselves seem entirely baffled. I have nowhere else to turn." Holmes settled into his armchair, steepling his long fingers beneath his pointed chin. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Pembroke. Spare no detail, however trivial it may appear. Remember, Watson," he glanced at me with that half-smile which always warned me that a particularly vexing problem was at hand. "It is often in the seemingly trivial that the most vital clue resides." Pembroke's voice shook as he recounted the tale, yet his words were precise, chosen with care. "I am the custodian of an ancestral house in Surrey," he began, "a residence of some antiquity, and until recently, quiet dignity. On the evening of the 23rd of November, I retired to my study, a small room adjoining my library. Locked each night for security, I lit my lamp as usual and set about reviewing some correspondence. Some time later, I was interrupted by a strange sound, a candle being extinguished. Yet, when I entered the adjoining room, I discovered a most dreadful sight." He paused, his hands trembling visibly upon his knees. "My valet, Mr. Thorne, was found dead. The door to the study had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. And yet, the candle, which should have burned throughout the evening, was found completely spent, as though someone had extinguished it in an unnatural haste. I confess, I do not understand it, and neither do the constables who have investigated." Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes glittering with an interest that was almost palpable. "A locked room scenario, Mr. Pembroke. Most intriguing. Pray, you are certain the room was locked from within, and that no window or secondary exit was accessible?" "Entirely certain," Pembroke replied. "I inspected every window myself. Each was latched and reinforced. The door, moreover, bore the marks of no tampering whatsoever. Scotland Yard has suggested accident, misadventure, perhaps even self-inflicted harm, but I cannot accept it. Mr. Thorne was the most trustworthy of men." Holmes rose abruptly, his long frame moving toward the window, gazing out at the thick, curling fog. "Watson, you perceive how the fog presses upon the city tonight. London herself seems to shroud secrets beneath her pall. And here we have one, confined not to alleys and courts, but within the very walls of a home. A candle, a locked room, a sudden death. I watched him, as I often did, with both admiration and a rising sense of unease. There was a method to the torrent of his thoughts, though the patterns were hidden beneath layers of observation. His mind, as always, leapt with almost preternatural speed. Mr. Pembroke, Holmes continued, I shall of course accept your case. The circumstances are indeed singular, and you may rest assured that no detail, however minute, shall escape my attention. Watson, you shall accompany me to Surrey at once. The night is advancing, yet there is no time to be lost if we are to observe the scene as it presents itself. Pembroke's relief was evident, though his anxiety had not fully abated. I am infinitely grateful, Mr. Holmes. I feared that I would be dismissed as a fanciful storyteller. Holmes gave a faint smile, one that revealed nothing of the thoughts that danced behind those penetrating eyes. Dismissed? On the contrary, sir. It is the fanciful, the unusual, and the inexplicable that most readily tempt my intellect. And you may take comfort in this. The inexplicable seldom remains so when subjected to the proper analysis. We gathered our coats and hats, and as we stepped into the foggy London street, the chill of the November air seemed to accentuate the tension that clung to us. Hansom cabs clattered past in the mist, their lamps casting eerie reflections upon the slick cobblestones. Holmes moved with an alertness that bordered on agitation, his eyes sweeping the dim street as if secrets were etched into the very brickwork. Watson, he murmured, do you feel it? That subtle thrum in the atmosphere? It is the pulse of a mystery, my friend. We have been summoned not to mere disorder, but to the brink of something profoundly intricate. I, for my part, felt a shiver of anticipation. There was no denying the peculiar nature of Pembroke's predicament, and, more than that, there was the unspoken certainty that Holmes' intellect would encounter a challenge worthy of its rare capabilities. The fog seemed to thicken around us as we made our way to the railway station, the city itself adopting the role of conspirator to an enigma that had yet to reveal its nature. As the train rocked through the night, I settled into my seat beside Holmes, observing him as he stared into the darkness beyond the window, his mind evidently engrossed in calculations and conjectures invisible to me. I had learned, over years of intimate association, that these silences were never idle. They were the prelude to deductions that would later astonish, enlighten, and sometimes discomfort. And so, with the clatter of wheels and the sigh of the night air, I found myself once again at the threshold of a case that promised to be unlike any we had previously encountered. The fog, the candle, the locked room lay combined into a riddle whose solution I could not yet imagine, but whose pursuit would demand all of our faculties. Little did I know that this night, and the days to follow, would plunge us into a labyrinth of misdirection, subtle menace, and an intellectual trial from which there would be no retreat. Holmes, finally turning his gaze toward me, spoke with an almost imperceptible smile. Prepare yourself, Watson. The game is afoot, and I suspect it shall be one of the most delicate and confounding of our acquaintance. I could only nod, the train rocking beneath us, as the misty countryside passed in a blur, carrying us toward Surrey, toward the ancestral house, and toward a mystery that would test the very limits of reason and perception. The journey to Surrey was longer than I had anticipated, not because of the distance itself, but because the fog had thickened into a nearly impenetrable curtain along the railway line. Each station we passed seemed to vanish as we approached, leaving us suspended in a sort of twilight that was neither night nor day. Holmes, however, was entirely undisturbed by the murk. He had settled into his habitual pose of intense contemplation, eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and lips pursed in the manner which always presaged an avalanche of deduction. When we finally alighted at the small station nearest to Pembroke Hall, the chill air of late November struck us with the force of a winter gale. Hansom cabs were scarce, and the one we found seemed to protest our weight with each jolt along the rough, unlit lane that led to the Pembroke estate. Yet, for all the discomfort, Holmes' eyes shone with anticipation. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, the subtle signs of habitation even from a distance, the glow of lamps in windows, smoke curling in minute quantities from chimneys, the faint impressions upon the gravel of repeated passage. All these will, in their due time, speak to us of life, activity, and perhaps concealment. Pembroke Hall itself was a structure of considerable antiquity, the sort of country house that one expects to see in illustrations of Gothic novels, rather than in actual existence. Its walls, constructed of stone darkened by centuries of rain and soot, bore the weight of history, while its high windows, set deep within thick frames, reflected the glow of the candelabra within. The main door, made of heavy oak reinforced with iron studs, stood imposingly before us. Mr. Pembroke, evidently anxious to expedite our entry, led us through the grand hall into a smaller vestibule adjoining the study where the tragic events had occurred. The air here was different from the damp chill outside. It carried a subtle mixture of wax polish, aged paper, and, faintly, something I could not immediately identify, but which would, I suspected, prove to be significant. Holmes paused at the doorway to the study, his eyes sweeping the room with a precision that seemed almost superhuman. "Notice, Watson," he said, the slight depression in the carpet near the chair by the fireplace. "It is subtle, yet it indicates not merely habitual use, but the precise manner in which our unfortunate valet favored his seating. Such details, while trivial to the ordinary observer, will allow us to reconstruct the last moments with startling fidelity." The room itself was modest, yet meticulously kept. Books lined the shelves in careful order, and the desk bore only a few pieces of correspondence, neatly arranged. A single candle, the source of the mysterious extinguishing, had been replaced after the event, though traces of blackened wax clung faintly to the brass holder. The fire in the hearth had long since cooled, leaving a layer of ash which still carried the faint, acrid scent of combustion. Holmes moved from object to object, noting the minutest irregularities. He examined the window latch with a delicate hand, tilted the candle holder, and even sniffed at the faint stain upon the carpet near the desk leg. "Curious," he murmured. "This mark does not conform to any pattern expected from ordinary activity. It suggests a disturbance, yes, though not one violent enough to attract immediate attention. And yet, the room remained locked. The paradox grows." I observed all that he did, recording mentally each of his remarks, though I felt, as always, that I was seeing only the surface of his perception. "Holmes," I ventured, "might it not be the case that someone entered, extinguished the candle, and escaped by some secret passage or concealed window?" Holmes shook his head with a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, that is the hypothesis of the ordinary mind. But let us consider. The room is not merely locked, the lock bears no tampering. The windows are firmly secured, with no sign of forced entry. And yet, as you say, the candle was extinguished."
What does this suggest?
He paused, letting the question linger. "Not intrusion, at least not conventional. Some other agency is at work here, one which obeys the laws of nature, but defies the expectations of the casual observer." Pembroke, standing anxiously near the door, interjected, "Then you do not believe it was an accident?" Holmes turned to him, eyes narrowing with an almost judicial severity. "Accident presupposes randomness. Randomness cannot account for what has occurred here. The room, the candle, the locked door, each element carries intention. Our task, Mr. Pembroke, is to uncover that intention, hidden though it may be." We spent the next hour examining the room in meticulous detail. Holmes' attention to minutiae was, as always, astonishing. He measured the height of the desk in relation to the chair, noted the precise angle of the candle's wick, and even ran a finger lightly along the surface of the papers, commenting on the slight indentation of writing as though it were a road map of thought. Each action seemed, to my untrained eye, almost obsessive, yet I was well aware that nothing he did was without purpose. Finally, he stood in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes closed in contemplation. "Watson," he said quietly, "I suspect that what we have here is a masterclass in psychological misdirection. The scene is designed to suggest the impossible, to lure the observer into error while concealing the simplest of truths." I looked at him, puzzled. Yet how can such misdirection exist within the confines of a locked room? Holmes opened his eyes, their grey brilliance catching the dim light. "Precisely because the room is locked, Watson. The locked room is not merely a physical impediment, it is a mental one. We are compelled to assume intrusion when, in truth, the solution may lie entirely within the room itself. We must consider not only the actions of our valet, but the possibilities inherent in the objects and their arrangement, and the very manner in which time and light interact within these walls." Pembroke, who had been listening in growing bewilderment, asked hesitantly, You think it could have been no one at all?" Holmes inclined his head slowly. "It is too early to assert conclusions, but the direction of my inquiry points toward an answer that defies the ordinary conception of presence and absence. I will, of course, require further investigation, particularly of Mr. Thorne's habits, his routines, and his interactions with both household and visitors. Sometimes the simplest answer is the one we overlook in our eagerness for complexity. As we prepared to leave the study, Holmes bent down and inspected the candle holder one final time, tapping it lightly against the palm of his hand. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious indeed. Watson, make careful note of the wax residue, the soot, the angle of extinguishment. Every detail, however minor it may seem, may prove crucial in the unraveling of this enigma." Walking back through the hall, I could not help but reflect upon the peculiar duality of Holmes' method, at once austere and delicate, analytical yet almost artistic. He saw patterns where I saw none, and yet he seemed entirely in control of the invisible threads connecting them. I sensed, though I could not yet define it, that this case would prove to be one of the most confounding we had ever undertaken. Holmes, as always, remained inscrutable. His mind, I knew, was already several steps ahead, tracing circuits of logic and probability that eluded me entirely. And yet, in his presence, the fog of uncertainty that clung to the house and its mysteries seemed almost to lift, revealing glimpses of hidden order beneath the apparent chaos. As we left Pembroke Hall that evening, the fog had thickened still further, curling around the trees and the hedgerows like a living shroud. Holmes, walking ahead, hands clasped behind him, spoke with his habitual calm certainty. "Watson, we are but at the threshold. The candle has been extinguished, the door locked, and the mind confounded. But every puzzle has a solution. We must only be patient and attentive and resolute." I nodded, my own anticipation mingling with a growing sense of awe. For, in the depths of that fog-bound Surrey evening, I could not yet imagine the complexity of the case that awaited us, the intricate deception, the subtle clues, and the hidden hand that had orchestrated this seemingly impossible crime. The next morning brought with it a sky of sullen grey, the type that presses down upon the soul and seems to linger in the corners of one's mind. Even Baker Street itself, normally animated by the restless stirrings of its residents, appeared subdued beneath the weight of the low-hanging clouds. Holmes, however, showed no sign of melancholy. He moved with his usual alertness, a hawk poised upon the precipice of deduction, his eyes flickering from one object to another as though the city itself were a repository of clues awaiting his scrutiny. It was not long before our first visitor arrived. A hansom cab rattled up to the door, and from it stepped a young woman of striking appearance, whose demeanor was at once composed and tense. She held herself with the poise of someone accustomed to polite society, yet her hands betrayed the slightest tremor, a subtle disclosure of underlying anxiety. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she inquired, her voice low but "I hope I am not intruding. My name is Clara Wentworth. I understand you have undertaken the investigation concerning Mr. Thorne's death at Pembroke Hall." Holmes, as was his habit, regarded her for a moment in silence. His eyes were analytical, noting everything from the neatness of her attire to the faint discoloration upon her gloves, the way her left shoe had a slight scuff at the heel, and even the scent of a particular lavender soap she carried. "You are indeed correct, Miss Wentworth. Pray, be seated. And might I inquire as to your connection with the deceased or the household?" She did not hesitate, though her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Thorne was my father's valet," she began, her voice quivering slightly. "Or rather, he was employed by my late father, and after his passing remained in service at Pembroke Hall under Mr. Pembroke." Holmes' interest was immediate. "Knowledge, you say? Speak freely. No detail is too..." She swallowed and then recounted her story with careful precision. "I had occasion to visit Pembroke Hall on the evening in question, to deliver some correspondence from London. I arrived shortly before dusk, and was admitted by Mr. Thorne himself. We conversed briefly, and he insisted upon escorting me to the study to deliver the papers personally. I remember noticing that he appeared unusually anxious, though he attempted to mask it. Shortly thereafter, he lit a candle and began reading one of the letters. That is the last I saw of him alive." Holmes inclined his head, listening intently. "And did you notice anything unusual about his demeanor, Miss Wentworth? Anything that might suggest apprehension, fear, or perhaps secrecy?" Clara's eyes widened, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second, which Holmes' gaze captured with remarkable acuity. He seemed preoccupied," she admitted. There was a look in his eyes, something I cannot describe precisely, an urgency, or perhaps dread. I thought little of it at the time, assuming it related to household affairs. But now, in light of what has happened, I cannot help but wonder whether he suspected something or feared some danger. Holmes rose abruptly, moving to the window and drawing aside the curtain, peering out into the street as though the fog itself might speak. "Ah, Watson," he murmured, almost to himself. Observe how the human mind records yet often misinterprets the minutest of gestures. Miss Wentworth's hesitation, her precise diction, the way she refrained from elaborating too soon all tell me that she is truthful, yet restrained. There is more to her account, though she is unaware of it herself. I looked at him, puzzled, as he returned to his chair and fixed the young woman with that penetrating stare. "Miss Wentworth, you say that you were present prior to Mr. Thorne's death. Did you note any unusual movement within the study, objects displaced, sounds unheard by the ordinary observer? Perhaps the flicker of candlelight in an odd manner?" She shook her head. "Nothing overt, sir. But the candle, yes, I recall it flickering as though moved by a draught, though the windows were closed. I dismissed it at the time, thinking it mere happenstance. But now, knowing what occurred, I cannot help but wonder if it was a sign of some manipulation." Holmes' fingers tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair. "Manipulation is precisely the word, Miss Wentworth, and your keen observation, though delayed, is of consequence. It may relate to the sequence of events we have yet to reconstruct fully." He then turned abruptly to me, his voice low but insistent. "Watson, note her attire and the scuff upon her shoe. It suggests she traversed uneven ground, likely near the eastern wing of Pembroke Hall. Combined with the minor lavender scent she carries, we may infer that she was in proximity to certain rooms where aromatic substances are stored. Small details, Watson, yet they may prove pivotal." Clara glanced between us, uncertainty flickering across her features. Am I under suspicion?" she asked timidly. Holmes' lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "Not in the least. In fact, it is precisely your candor and composure that render you useful to our investigation. One must always differentiate between the guilty and the informed. You belong to the latter category." Pembroke, who had been silently observing from a corner, finally spoke, his voice edged with relief. "Miss Wentworth, your presence here is most welcome. I feared that the death of my valet would remain shrouded in uncertainty. Perhaps you may assist us in understanding his last hours more clearly than any of us could alone." Holmes' attention, however, had shifted subtly. He rose and moved toward the mantel, examining the small clock that had remained on the shelf throughout our initial inspection. He tapped its surface lightly, listened to the faint tick, and then examined the dust upon the top. "Watson," he murmured, "observe how even the most seemingly insignificant objects carry a record of time, motion, and intention. This clock, though simple, may reveal the interval during which Mr. Thorne was engaged with his duties or, indeed, when he was interrupted." Turning back to Clara, Holmes asked, "Miss Wentworth, have you noticed anyone else frequenting the study? Servants, visitors, perhaps a member of the household whose presence might have been unrecorded?" She shook her head, though a shadow passed across her countenance. "No, sir. But there is one person I have not mentioned, a distant cousin of mine, Harold Fenwick. He occasionally visits Pembroke Hall, and though I had no reason to expect him that evening, I cannot be certain whether he might have arrived unannounced. He's curious, somewhat impetuous, and I have always found his temperament unpredictable." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Ah, now we have the first potential deviation from expectation. Impetuosity often breeds error and, in the case of criminal or inadvertent mischief, it may prove decisive." I noted the subtle shift in Holmes' demeanor. He had, at once, identified a possible suspect, though not the true culprit, and yet, as always, he allowed the misdirection to remain unexplained. "So we are to consider Mr. Fenwick?" I asked cautiously. Holmes inclined his head. "We shall consider all avenues, Watson, for it is in the interplay of motive, opportunity, and subtle deception that the solution lies. Let us, then, visit Pembroke Hall once more, and, if Miss Wentworth will accompany us, attempt to trace the movements of all who were present or could have been present during those critical hours." As we prepared to depart, I could not help but reflect on the delicate manner in which Holmes had navigated the situation. Clara Wentworth, though nervous, had provided us with both information and, perhaps more importantly, a a clue to human behavior. And yet, I sensed that Holmes' mind had already begun to discern layers of complexity hidden beneath her account. The fog outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows of Baker Street as if to warn us that the case ahead would not yield its secrets easily. A locked room, a candle extinguished, a valet dead, and now the subtle hints of distant relatives and unexpected visitors all combined to form a tapestry whose full pattern remained tantalizingly just beyond our grasp. Holmes, walking ahead of us toward the waiting cab, muttered quietly, yet with that unmistakable tone of certainty. "Watson, the game proceeds. The first suspect is never the culprit, but every first suspect illuminates the path. Observe closely, for in observation lies the key to understanding." I followed him into the cab, heart quickened with anticipation, aware that this case would test every faculty I possessed and that, as ever, Holmes' intellect would lead us through shadows and fog toward a solution that none but he could yet foresee. The morning following our initial visit to Pembroke Hall dawned bleak and oppressive, with a drizzle that seemed to seep into both bone and spirit. London itself was obscured beneath a relentless veil of fog and rain, as if the city were conspiring to mirror the disquiet that had taken hold of our household. Holmes, as usual, was unfazed by the damp, and his energy, far from diminished, seemed to thrive upon the peculiarities of this most enigmatic case. We had returned to Baker Street with instructions from Pembroke to await further developments. Yet Holmes, impatient with inaction, insisted upon an immediate review of the evidence we had gathered. Sitting in his armchair, pipe in hand, he spread before him the notes I had taken and the recollections Miss Wentworth had provided. The methodical scrutiny with which he approached each sentence and detail suggested that he was already several steps beyond ordinary comprehension, piecing together a puzzle that I barely discerned. "Watson," he began, tapping a long forefinger upon the page, "it is the inconsistencies that demand our attention. Observe the timeline as described by Miss Wentworth. She claims to have delivered correspondence and observed Mr. Thorne light a candle and begin reading. The interval between her arrival and the discovery of his death, she suggests, was brief, yet it is precisely in this briefness that the enigma lies." I furrowed my brow. "You mean the time does not correspond with the state of the candle?" "Exactly," he said, eyes gleaming. "A candle of that size and quality should not have been extinguished so completely within the span she describes. Either the time is misstated, which, given her evident honesty, seems unlikely, or some external factor was at work. A draft, perhaps, or a mechanism of some subtle design. And here, Watson, is the crucial point. None of the windows were open, and no door had been forced. The extinguishing of the candle cannot be accounted for by ordinary means. This is our first true clue, hidden, subtle, yet undeniable." I leaned closer, attempting to follow the trajectory of his reasoning. "A hidden mechanism, then? A draft, as you suggest?" Holmes shook his head with a faint smile. "Not quite. It is more psychological than mechanical, though the two are often intertwined. The true marvel of this case lies in the interplay between perception and reality. The room itself is an agent of deception, the candle, the lock. The position of objects they are arranged to convey one impression, while the reality is entirely different. Our task is to penetrate the illusion." At that moment, a sharp knock at the door interrupted our deliberation. Holmes, ever courteous yet brisk, called for the visitor to enter. The door swung open, revealing a stout, red-faced inspector from Scotland Yard, whose presence I had grown accustomed to during other, less puzzling inquiries. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, removing his hat and bowing slightly. "I trust I am not intruding upon your consultation." "Not at all, Inspector Lestrade," Holmes replied, rising and inclining his head. "On the contrary, your arrival is timely. Please sit. Perhaps you may enlighten us as to the latest developments at Pembroke Hall." Lestrade seated himself with a mixture of deference and impatience. "Well, sir, the coroner has concluded his initial examination. No signs of foul play, he insists, and attributes Mr. Thorne's death to sudden natural causes. But I have my doubts. A valet in perfect health, found dead in a locked room, with no apparent cause. There's more to it than simple misadventure, I assure you." Holmes raised a single eyebrow, his expression at once mildly amused and intensely focused. "I share your doubts, Inspector. Tell me, has anyone else been observed near the study, aside from Mr. Pembroke and the young lady, Miss Wentworth?" Lestrade hesitated, glancing nervously at me before replying. "There is one individual of note, a distant relative of the family, Harold Fenwick. He was seen in the grounds on the evening in question, though he claims no entry to the house occurred. The staff, however, reports that he was rather insistent upon remaining near the eastern wing for some time. I suspect nothing, of course, but, well, the circumstances are curious." Holmes' eyes narrowed, and I observed him as he leaned forward, steepling his fingers once more. "Curious indeed, Inspector. You perceive, Watson, how the apparent simplicity of a single observation may conceal layers of complexity. Fenwick's presence, or at least the perception of it, may serve as a convenient misdirection. The mind, when presented with a hint of familiarity, often ignores the subtler truths concealed nearby." I nodded, though I confess that some of the subtleties eluded me. Holmes, however, seemed already several moves ahead, envisioning the entire tableau with a precision that left me both awed and bewildered. Lestrade, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, continued, "We have also interviewed the staff. All report that Mr. Thorne behaved normally, save for a certain anxiety, perhaps. Nothing untoward, though one of the maids mentioned he had spoken of a peculiar obligation earlier in the week, which she could not fully comprehend. Odd, I think, though I cannot make sense of it." Holmes' fingers tapped rapidly upon his knees. "A peculiar obligation, you say? Every word matters, Watson. Language, when precise, often encodes more than the speaker intends. Mr. Thorne's anxiety, coupled with this cryptic phrase, may very well illuminate motives or constraints otherwise hidden." He paused for a moment, then stood abruptly and strode toward the window, hands clasped behind him as he surveyed the foggy street below. "Watson, we must return to Pembroke Hall without delay. There is something that escaped my notice on our first visit, something so subtle that it exists almost beyond perception. Yet I am convinced it will prove pivotal." I rose immediately, sensing the urgency in his manner. "Shall we request the presence of Miss Wentworth as well?" Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. The hidden clue must first reveal itself to us in the physical space. Witness testimony, while valuable, may distort the perception of reality. We shall return to the study and observe directly. It is in observation, Watson, that the truth lies, often masked by the simplest of illusions." The cab ride to Pembroke Hall was tense with anticipation. Holmes' mind, as always, seemed to operate at a velocity far exceeding that of ordinary men. He spoke little, though his eyes darted from the passing street lamps to the fog-laden hedgerows, noting subtle variations in pattern, spacing, and light. Upon arrival, we were admitted at once by Mr. Pembroke, who appeared visibly relieved by our prompt return. "I trust no news has arrived to complicate matters further," he said, wringing his hands nervously. Holmes inclined his head curtly. "Only news of potential subtle inconsistencies, sir. We shall examine the study directly, and perhaps uncover an element that has hitherto escaped attention." The study, upon our second inspection, seemed unchanged to any but the most discerning eye. Holmes, however, immediately noticed what I had overlooked the previous day. A small indentation upon the floor beneath the desk, faint but measurable, a subtle discoloration upon the carpet near the candle holder, almost invisible to ordinary perception, and, most intriguing of all, a microscopic streak of soot along the inside edge of the window frame, as if a flame had been briefly brought close to the glass without opening it. "Watson," Holmes whispered, eyes alight with intensity, "observe these marks carefully. The sequence is clear, though it eludes all who fail to inspect with precision. There was indeed an interference with the candle, yet no ordinary mechanism explains it. And now we see the first whisper of the hidden hand, the clue that must guide our understanding." As we stood in the dim light of the study, the fog pressing against the panes and the hearth cold, I realized that the case was no longer merely puzzling. It was an intricate tapestry of observation, subtle misdirection, and almost imperceptible evidence. Holmes, as always, was several steps ahead, yet the solution remained tantalizingly beyond my grasp. He turned to me with a smile that was part satisfaction, part challenge. "Watson, the game proceeds, and we are at last on the cusp of discovery. This hidden clue shall, I suspect, unravel the mystery in ways that none anticipate, revealing the interplay of intention and circumstance with that rare precision which distinguishes the merely curious from the truly discerning." I could only nod, my mind racing to keep pace with his inexorable logic. aware that the days ahead would be filled with revelation, deception, and the meticulous unraveling of a riddle that defied all ordinary explanation. The following days were a study in contrasts, dull in appearance, yet brimming with a tension that seemed to press against every corner of our lodgings. London's streets remained cloaked in fog, the gas lamps casting diffused halos upon the slick cobblestones, and every passing hansom clattered like a harbinger of unease. For Holmes, however, such atmospheric gloom was not a deterrent. It seemed to invigorate him, sharpening his senses and causing his already penetrating gaze to pierce even the most ordinary of objects for hidden significance. We returned to Pembroke Hall at dawn, summoned once again by Mr. Pembroke, who greeted us with evident relief, and, if I might venture, growing apprehension. "I feared, Mr. Holmes, that this matter would remain obscured," he said, wringing his hands. "Yet your presence gives hope that clarity may come." Holmes inclined his head, his expression serene, yet the subtle tension in his shoulders suggested a mind already racing ahead. "Clarity, sir, is often obscured not by absence but by misperception. We shall see what truths reveal themselves today. Watson, observe closely the minutest shift in the environment often speaks volumes where words fail." The study, when we entered, had been maintained in the precise state we had left it. Yet Holmes' eyes immediately darted to details I had overlooked. The slight displacement of papers on the desk, the faint impression of a heel mark upon the carpet, and, most subtly, a near-invisible wisp of soot clinging to the window's interior edge. He crouched, fingers tracing the pattern upon the floor. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe how every motion leaves a signature. The room itself preserves the memory of actions, even when human witnesses fail to perceive them." I leaned closer, peering over his shoulder, noting the impressions he indicated. "You believe, then, that the candle's extinguishing can be reconstructed?" Holmes nodded, eyes alight. "Indeed, and more. I suspect that Mr. Thorne's death was not an isolated event. The careful arrangement of objects, the manipulation of perception, and the subtle placement of cues all suggest a mind meticulous in its orchestration. One cannot confine such planning to a single act." Our examination was interrupted by a commotion in the hall, a series of hurried footsteps, followed by a sharp, anxious voice. The door swung open to admit a young footman, red-faced and panting. "Sir! Sir! There's been another incident." Holmes straightened instantly, his demeanor shifting from contemplative to alert. "Explain, man," he commanded, his voice calm but edged with steel. The footman struggled to catch his breath. "It's Mr. Pembroke's library, sir. Someone has forced entry. The French windows were broken and the papers, they've been rifled through." Pembroke, who had been standing nearby, paled visibly. "Impossible. I left the house secure. Nothing could have entered the library unnoticed except—" His voice faltered. "Except what, sir?" Holmes asked. "Except perhaps someone familiar with the house, someone who knows its routines," Pembroke replied. Holmes' eyes narrowed, and he moved swiftly toward the hallway, gesturing for me and Pembroke to follow. "Watson, every breach, every apparent violation is a communication. The criminal leaves his signature, deliberately or not. We must observe the evidence before drawing conclusions from conjecture. The library, when we entered, bore signs of disturbance indeed. The French windows had been forced open, leaving splintered wood and shards of glass upon the floor. Papers were strewn across the carpet, yet nothing of notable value appeared to be missing. Holmes examined the broken latch and the surrounding woodwork with meticulous care. "Notice, Watson," he said quietly, "the angle of force. It is deliberate, precise, yet executed by a hand that is not unpracticed. This is no mere opportunist. This is someone who understands both the layout of the house and the significance of items within it." I could see the tension rising in Pembroke, who gestured helplessly at the disarray. But why? What could anyone hope to gain by such a search? There is nothing of value here, nothing beyond ordinary correspondence and family papers. Holmes, however, was already moving from object to object, inspecting ink stains, impressions upon paper, and the faint tracks upon the rug. It is precisely because the value is not monetary that we must pay attention. Watson, the criminal seeks knowledge, not gold. The act is deliberate, targeted, and, as you may note, performed with extreme care. Observe, the papers have been rifled through, yet those which might attract immediate attention remain untouched. The misdirection is intentional. I could not help but shiver at the implication. The perpetrator, whoever he was, seemed to anticipate our every step, manipulating both environment and expectation with astonishing skill. Holmes bent to examine a small piece of paper, nearly overlooked amid the scattered documents. "Watson, see here, the corner of this note bears a crease that does not belong to ordinary handling. It suggests it was folded to conceal something beneath. Yet nothing appears hidden now. Someone has taken care to leave an illusion of tampering while removing or perhaps confirming the information they sought." Pembroke, anxiety written plainly upon his features, asked, Is it possible that the same person was involved in both Mr. Thorne's death and this intrusion?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with that cold, calculating light I had come to recognize. "Entirely possible, and I would suggest highly probable. Observe the sequence, the method, the subtle cues left in each instance. We are dealing with a mind that operates with foresight, patience, and a mastery of psychological manipulation. This is no ordinary criminal." A sudden noise, a faint scuffing from the adjoining corridor, caused Holmes to pivot sharply, his hand moving instinctively to his coat pocket where he carried a small magnifying glass. The sound, however, proved to be merely a passing servant delivering refreshments. Yet it reminded us that observation, continuous and unbroken, was essential. Holmes turned back to the library, crouching near the French windows. "Watson, see how the angle of the break aligns precisely with the path one would take to avoid footprints upon the rug. Every detail has been anticipated by our adversary. And yet, even in this mastery there remains an imperfection, a trace that speaks to the true method employed." I watched as he meticulously examined the ground near the window, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Another clue, Watson," he murmured, almost to himself. "Small, subtle, yet unmistakable to the trained eye. It will illuminate the entire sequence of events, once we piece it together with care." The tension in the room was palpable, a blend of fear, anticipation, and the electric thrill of a challenge that promised to stretch the very limits of reasoning. Holmes, ever implacable, moved from detail to detail, seemingly indifferent to the chaos around him, yet in truth orchestrating an analysis of extraordinary depth. As we departed Pembroke Hall that evening, the fog clinging to the trees like a living shroud, I could not shake the sense that we were being drawn into a labyrinth of intrigue far deeper than any I had previously encountered. A valet dead under mysterious circumstances, a candle extinguished in a locked room, a library rifled with intent. These incidents, disparate yet connected, hinted at a mind operating on a plane of cunning I could scarcely comprehend. Holmes, walking ahead, hands clasped behind his back, spoke quietly, yet with unmistakable determination. "Watson, the stakes have risen. Our adversary is patient, deliberate, and precise. But patience, while a virtue in one, may prove a weakness in another. The game proceeds, and we are on the threshold of revelation. Observe closely, question every assumption, and above all, trust nothing that appears obvious." I followed him into the cab, heart pounding, aware that the days ahead would demand all of our faculties and that the hidden hand orchestrating these events was more skillful than any we had yet encountered. The rising tension, like the encroaching fog, pressed upon us, promising revelations, misdirection, and a trial of intellect from which there could be no retreat. The following day dawned with a pall of damp fog and a chill that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Yet Baker Street remained alive with the low murmur of morning activity. Holmes, as ever, was already awake and seated at his table, examining the fragments of paper, traces of soot, and wax impressions we had collected from Pembroke Hall. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity which had so often forewarned me of the discovery of subtle, almost imperceptible clues. "I have been reflecting, Watson," he said, steepling his long fingers, "on the manner in which the second incident, the intrusion into the library, was executed. There are elements that defy conventional reasoning, yet they are not inexplicable. They are, in truth, designed to mislead, to channel suspicion away from the true method and the actual culprit." I leaned forward eagerly, trying to anticipate his train of thought. "You mean the footprints, the broken French windows, the papers rifled about?" "Precisely," he replied, eyes narrowing. "Every detail has been carefully curated. Observe, the path to the library was orchestrated to avoid leaving obvious traces. Yet small inconsistencies remain, tiny dust disturbances, faint impressions of heels upon the carpet, even subtle shifts in the positioning of objects that suggest the criminal is human, not supernatural. And from these inconsistencies, we may reconstruct the sequence of events with precision. Our discussion was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Lestrade, the inspector from Scotland Yard, whose countenance was a mixture of irritation and exasperation. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," he exclaimed, removing his hat. "You must come at once to Pembroke Hall. Something extraordinary has occurred." Holmes inclined his head, expression calm yet alert. "Extraordinary, Inspector. Do proceed with your account." Lestrade's voice lowered, as though he feared we might misinterpret or discount his words. "One of the servants discovered a small locked cabinet in the servants' quarters, an item I can only describe as unusual. When they attempted to open it, the lock had been tampered with, though only slightly. Nothing of value seems to have been taken, yet the disturbance is undeniable. I fear that we are dealing with someone who intends to provoke uncertainty and fear rather than simple theft or mischief." Holmes' eyes gleamed with sharp intensity. "Fear is indeed a powerful instrument, Inspector. But note, every action, every manipulation of objects and perception is calculated. The criminal is not motivated by passion alone, but by logic and anticipation." Within the hour, we found ourselves once more traversing the fog-laden streets toward Pembroke Hall. Holmes, walking ahead, seemed attuned to every nuance: the uneven pavement, the subtle curvatures of the hedgerows, the shifting weight of the cab under the cobblestones. His eyes flicked from shadow to shadow as if the fog itself carried messages intelligible only to him. Upon arrival, we were greeted by Mr. Pembroke, his features drawn with worry. "I cannot comprehend it, Mr. Holmes," he said, wringing his hands. "Every precaution has been taken to secure the house, yet these disturbances continue. I feel as though some unseen force toys with us at will." Holmes gave him a faint smile. "No unseen force, sir. Only a mind of remarkable cunning, operating within the limitations of physical reality. Let us examine this latest anomaly." The cabinet in question was a modest piece, ornately carved, situated in the servants' quarters, yet obviously not intended for casual inspection. Holmes examined the lock with meticulous care, noting the fine scratches along its surface and the almost imperceptible misalignment of its internal mechanism. "Watson," he whispered, "see here. The manipulation is subtle yet deliberate. Our criminal is clever, careful to leave a trace sufficient to be noticed, yet insufficient to provide conclusive evidence. It is a masterful misdirection, designed to draw attention while concealing true intent elsewhere." I could not help but admire the precision of his observation, though I struggled to keep pace with the rapid deductions forming in his mind. "Do you believe, Holmes, that these incidents, the library, the cabinet, the locked room, are connected?" "Undoubtedly," he replied. "Observe, Watson, how each disturbance directs attention, misleads perception, and yet leaves a faint whisper of truth in its wake. The mind that orchestrates such events understands not merely the physical, but the psychological landscape. And it is within this landscape that we must seek the true culprit." Our attention was drawn, however, to a sudden commotion outside the hallway. We turned to see Clara Wentworth herself, breathless and alarmed, approaching with a hurried pace. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she exclaimed, "I have discovered something that may be important." While searching the eastern wing for a misplaced letter, I noticed that a small ventilation grate, ordinarily sealed, had been tampered with. "It is subtle, but unmistakable." Holmes' eyes gleamed with immediate recognition. "Ah, yes. The overlooked avenues of ingress and egress, Watson. Observe how the criminal exploits minor, seemingly trivial features of architecture: grates, recesses, and passages ordinarily ignored. These are not mere conveniences. They are instruments of misdirection, facilitating both access and concealment." Pembroke, alarmed, asked, "Then this proves someone entered where they should not have?" Holmes shook his head slightly, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "Not necessarily entered, sir, but it suggests the potential for entrance, and it forces us to reconsider the timeline, the sequence of events, and the possible presence of individuals within spaces presumed secure. Misdirection, Mr. Pembroke, is as much about suggestion as execution. Observe how fear and expectation are manipulated." I watched, fascinated, as Holmes meticulously examined the grate, noting minute scratches, slight discoloration, and a faint accumulation of dust along the edges, details invisible to anyone but him. "Watson," he whispered, "these subtle traces are the fingerprints of intention. They reveal not merely the presence of another, but the methods, habits, and even temperament of our adversary. From these we may begin to reconstruct the true sequence of events." The atmosphere in the house had grown taut with apprehension. Every shadow seemed a potential clue, every misplaced object a possible indicator of intent. Yet Holmes moved with calm precision, his mind an engine of analysis, perceiving patterns where the rest of us saw only chaos. Finally, after hours of inspection, he straightened and faced Pembroke. "Sir, I advise vigilance but not panic. The disturbances, though unnerving, serve a purpose beyond mere mischief. They are designed to obscure the truth and to channel attention toward false conclusions. Observe closely, and you will see that every anomaly is a carefully placed piece upon the board. Our task is to discern the strategy, rather than be distracted by the pieces themselves." As we departed that evening, the fog pressing against the windows and hedgerows like a living shroud, I reflected upon the intricacy of the unfolding events. A valet dead in a locked room, a library rifled with intent, a cabinet tampered, a ventilation grate disturbed. Each incident, seemingly unrelated, now revealed a pattern of calculated misdirection. Holmes, walking ahead of us toward the waiting cab, muttered quietly, yet with unmistakable determination, "Watson, our adversary is both clever and audacious. But in audacity lies vulnerability. Observe closely, question everything, and the hidden hand will reveal itself not in the bold act, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible traces left behind." I followed him into the cab, heart quickened, aware that the mystery had deepened, that misdirection had proliferated, and that every step forward would demand both vigilance and intellect of the highest order. The game was afoot, and the shadows of deception stretched long before us, promising both peril and revelation. The fog that enveloped London that morning seemed almost symbolic of the mental state in which we found ourselves. Each step along the cobblestones of Baker Street felt as though we were treading through the very uncertainty that had settled over Pembroke Hall. Holmes, however, displayed none of the apprehension that might accompany such persistent enigma. He moved with his customary precision, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, observing the minutest signs of human activity as though they were etched into the very... "I have been considering, Watson," he began in his low, contemplative voice as we prepared to depart, "that our adversary's method subtle, patient, and psychologically manipulative necessitates a strategy that is equally subtle. A direct approach is ill-advised. One must instead employ the mind as both lens and instrument, guiding the opponent toward actions of his own revealing." I frowned slightly, trying to comprehend the depth of his meaning. "You mean a trap of sorts?" "Indeed, Watson, but not a trap of violence or coercion. Our weapon is perception, our lure is suggestion. The criminal seeks to misdirect, to obscure reality. If we can influence his expectations without his knowledge, we may compel him to expose both method and motive." Upon arrival at Pembroke Hall, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The house itself seemed to bristle with anticipation, as though aware that the next move would prove decisive. Holmes, without preamble, inspected the study, library, and the faintly disturbed cabinet in the servants' quarters, his eyes gleaming with insight. Watson noticed the sequence of disturbances, he murmured, gesturing toward the scattered papers in the library. "Each is designed to convey urgency, to suggest intrusion, yet all lack real consequence. Observe the precision with which the disarray is calculated. There is method in apparent chaos, and it is this method we must exploit." Pembroke, anxious and still trembling from the recent series of events, asked, "And how, Mr. Holmes, do you propose to confront this person? How can one anticipate the actions of someone so careful?" Holmes' eyes, sharp and unwavering, met Pembroke's. "By creating a situation in which the criminal is compelled to act in accordance with his own habits. By presenting opportunity, expectation, and suggestion, we may predict his movement. Observe, Watson, the psychological framework of his actions. He is meticulous, deliberate, and confident in his intellect. Confidence is a weapon, but also a liability it tempts overreach. We must construct the stage upon which his hand reveals itself." As the day progressed, Holmes began to implement his plan with careful discretion. We reviewed the known timeline of Mr. Thorne's final hours, the intervals during which Miss Wentworth had been present, and the suspected presence of Harold Fenwick in the eastern wing. Holmes drew diagrams, traced lines of sight, and marked potential points of entry and exit with a meticulousness that verged on obsession. "Watson," he said, pausing to tap his long forefinger upon a map of the estate. "This is where subtlety proves crucial. The criminal operates under the assumption that we cannot perceive hidden avenues of ingress. Our task is to convert that assumption into certainty, to make him believe his methods are invisible while guiding him toward predictable action." I observed him in fascination, noting how his eyes shifted from one detail to another, calculating angles of observation, probability of exposure, and even the faint psychological pressures that might compel a suspect to act. Holmes' strategy was not one of force but of intellectual manipulation. He was, as always, playing chess in a game in which only he could foresee all the moves. By evening, the first phase of his plan was in motion. Certain areas of the house were subtly prepared objects repositioned, small traces of disturbance left intentionally, and doors left slightly ajar to suggest access. Miss Wentworth, unaware of the full import of our actions, was asked to observe certain rooms while avoiding direct interference. Even Pembroke, instructed to follow minimal routines, became an unwitting participant in Holmes' psychological orchestration. Holmes and I spent hours monitoring the estate from discreet vantage points, using the windows of the upper floors to observe shadows, movement, and patterns of human behavior in the dim, fog-laden light. "Note, Watson," he whispered as we watched a figure approach the library, "how the mere suggestion of opportunity provokes action. The criminal believes he is unseen, that his movements are unobserved. Yet we are already 3 steps ahead." The figure, cloaked and cautious, lingered near the library windows before retreating briefly into shadow. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he whispered, "Patience, Watson. Observe how anticipation governs behavior. Every subtle hesitation, every glance, every motion conveys intention. Our adversary is performing precisely as expected." We waited, motionless and silent, until the figure returned, attempting to access a portion of the house we had prepared for observation. Holmes, barely moving, noted each detail: the angle of approach, the pressure of the feet upon the gravel, the faint touch upon a window latch. "See, Watson," he murmured, "he cannot resist the illusion of accessibility. Each action confirms our understanding, validates our reconstruction, and brings us closer to uncovering the mind behind the events." The night deepened, and the fog grew thick around the estate, muffling sounds and casting the house into an almost spectral stillness. Holmes, still observing, finally straightened and whispered with quiet satisfaction, "The first phase of the plan is complete. We have drawn him out, exposed the pattern of his movements, and observed the subtle traces of method and habit. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall refine the trap, guiding him toward an encounter that will reveal both motive and mechanism." I could scarcely contain my admiration for Holmes' ingenuity. The criminal, confident in his mastery of deception, was being led inexorably into the very scrutiny he sought to avoid. Every precaution, every act of misdirection, was being countered not by force or confrontation, but by the patient, almost artistic application of logic, observation, and psychological insight. As we retired to our rooms that night, I reflected upon the extraordinary skill required to manipulate an opponent's expectations so completely. Holmes, lying awake with eyes half closed, whispered, almost to himself, "Patience, Watson. Every mind has a weakness, and every pattern, however cunningly concealed, will betray itself under the scrutiny of deliberate observation. We are ready for the next act, and the final curtain draws ever nearer." The shadows of London pressed against our windows, fog curling like living fingers around the street lamps. Yet within Baker Street, calm precision reigned. Holmes had already set the pieces in motion, and the invisible hand guiding the events at Pembroke Hall would, at last, begin to reveal itself in full. The early morning fog clung stubbornly to the streets of London, as though unwilling to relinquish its dominion, wrapping the city in a somber and disquieting haze. From Baker Street the world appeared as an abstract canvas of diffused light and shadow, and even the distant rumble of horse-drawn cabs seemed muffled beneath its weight. Yet within our rooms Holmes moved with purpose, his mind already several steps ahead of my own, calculating, anticipating, and preparing for the final act of the investigation. Holmes had been unusually silent during breakfast, his eyes occasionally flitting to my notes, then returning to the fire with a distant, almost contemplative stare. I had learned long ago that such silence, far from indicating inactivity, presaged some profound development in his reasoning. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low and precise, "today the pattern of deception begins to unravel. The criminal, confident in his mastery, has underestimated both our patience and the capacity of observation. Every move he makes is anticipated, and the trap which has been laid will, at last, compel exposure." I could not conceal my curiosity. "Holmes, I have followed your instructions carefully, observed the pathways, noted the subtle traces, yet I confess that the solution remains elusive. Can you, at least, hint at the direction in which this will unfold?" Holmes' lips twitched in a faint, sardonic smile. "Merely hints, Watson. The mind that orchestrates such events thrives upon ambiguity. We shall allow him to believe he controls the narrative, even as the threads we have prepared guide him inexorably toward revelation." By mid-morning we were once more en route to Pembroke Hall, the cab navigating the foggy streets with caution. Holmes, seated forward, eyes alert, began to outline the sequence we anticipated. The subtle disturbances, Mr. Thorne's death in the locked study, the rifling of the library, the tampering of the cabinet, the manipulation of the ventilation grate were all designed to convey disorder, yet they concealed a single underlying intention. Each act was both misdirection and message, and the criminal, in his meticulousness, had left the faintest traces by which his methods might be reconstructed. Upon arrival, Pembroke met us with an anxious countenance. "I fear another incident may occur," he said. "The house seems unsettled, and the servants are uneasy." Holmes inclined his head calmly. "Rest assured, sir, we are prepared for any eventuality. Observation and anticipation are our allies. We shall permit events to unfold while carefully noting the choices made by the person whose actions have perplexed us thus far." We proceeded to the study, library, and various passages of the eastern wing, Holmes moving with deliberate care, observing angles of entry, the position of objects, and even the behavior of the servants, who went about their tasks with an unspoken tension. It was at the study, however, that he paused, crouching to examine the candle holder, the faint traces of soot, and the minuscule indentations upon the floor. "Watson," he whispered, "see here. These traces are not random. They map a sequence of movements, a choreography, if you will, intended to mislead observers. But the choreography contains a flaw, subtle yet decisive. The criminal has relied upon our assumptions, our expectations, to conceal the true method. This is the point at which we strike." As the day wore on, Holmes' preparations began to bear fruit. Shadows moved within the house in ways that suggested deliberate but cautious exploration, and at last, the figure of Harold Fenwick, the cousin Miss Wentworth had mentioned, appeared, drawn by the subtle cues we had left. He moved with care, inspecting the areas we had subtly left unguarded, and yet each of his steps betrayed his expectations, which Holmes had anticipated fully. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, voice barely above a whisper, "how confidence can be manipulated. Fenwick believes he acts in secret, yet each action confirms our understanding of his methods. The slightest hesitation, every misjudged step, exposes his presence in both time and space." We followed discreetly, observing him approach the library, glance at the disarray of papers, and inspect the broken French windows. His attention then shifted to the ventilation grate, which he examined with curious precision. Here Holmes' plan came to fruition. Fenwick, believing he was unseen, attempted a maneuver that would reveal both motive and technique. "Patience, Watson," Holmes said softly, "and watch closely. The trap is in the expectation, not the confrontation. The criminal's confidence is the key to his undoing." Fenwick, moving to lift the cabinet in the servants' quarters, was suddenly confronted not by Holmes directly, but by a subtle device we had arranged. A small mirror angled to reflect his actions toward a secondary observer, Miss Wentworth, who had been discreetly positioned. The reaction, brief but telling a slight start, a stammer of recognition, the briefest flush of fear was all Holmes needed. "He believes he is master of the situation," Holmes whispered. "Yet in reality he has been guided at every step. Observe the pattern of his choices, the subtle footprints of intention now betray him completely." We allowed Fenwick a few more moments, noting the precise methods by which he manipulated objects. his careful avoidance of obvious traces, and his meticulous attention to detail. Each movement confirmed Holmes' reconstruction of events. The locked room, the extinguished candle, the disturbances in the library and cabinet hall were within his orchestration, yet each left a faint signature of human imperfection. Finally, Holmes motioned for us to approach. Fenwick, startled, attempted a feigned calm, but the mask could not conceal the tension in his shoulders, the rapid flicker of his eyes, or the faint tremor of his hands. Holmes stepped forward, his manner calm yet implacable. "Mr. Fenwick," he said, voice carrying the precise weight of authority, "you have labored under the illusion of control. Yet every choice you have made, every step you have taken, has been anticipated. Your manipulations, though subtle, betray both intent and method. I now ask you to account for your actions, knowing that observation has rendered deception impossible." Fenwick's lips parted, and for a moment the only sound was the faint drip of condensation from the fog-laden windows. Then slowly he began to speak, revealing the tangled web of motives, secrets, and miscalculations that had guided his actions. Every piece fell into place, each disturbance explained, each misdirection accounted for. And yet, the brilliance of Holmes' orchestration lay not merely in uncovering the culprit, but in revealing the precision with which human behavior, flawed, impulsive, and self-assured, could be guided toward revelation. As Fenwick's confession unfolded, I marveled, as always, at Holmes' foresight, patience, and understanding of the human mind. The puzzle, complex and multi-layered, had been unraveled through observation, anticipation, and subtle psychological manipulation. And yet, even as the truth emerged, the elegance of Holmes' methods remained, as ever, partially concealed to all but him. The fog outside thickened, curling around Pembroke Hall like a shroud, yet within the house, clarity reigned. The trap had succeeded, the criminal exposed, and the intricate web of misdirection, fear, and deception finally unraveled under the relentless scrutiny of Holmes' intellect. It was late afternoon when we reconvened in the drawing room of Pembroke Hall, the storm having finally relented to a melancholy drizzle that left the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Holmes had insisted upon gathering all principal parties, Mr. Pembroke, Miss Wentworth, Inspector Lestrade, and inevitably, the now subdued Harold Fenwick, so that the final revelations could unfold in a manner both methodical and complete. The air was thick with anticipation, the sort of tension that seems to settle before the last pieces of a puzzle fall into place. Holmes, seated with his usual composure, motioned for us all to remain standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deliberate and precise, "we have been presented with a series of events designed to confound, mislead, and terrify. A valet's death in a locked study, disturbances in the library, tampering with a cabinet, manipulation of a ventilation grate-hole, seemingly disconnected, yet all orchestrated with intent and precision." Pembroke, visibly anxious, asked, "But Mr. Holmes, surely one mind could not commit such elaborate acts without being discovered?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with his familiar cold intensity. "Ah, but that is precisely the brilliance of our adversary, Mr. Pembroke. He relied upon expectation, perception, and misdirection. Each act was designed to conceal the truth, yet reveal it simultaneously to a careful observer. The mistake, however, lies in the overconfidence that accompanies mastery. Every action, no matter how subtle, bears a trace, and it is this trace that has betrayed him." He turned to Fenwick, who shifted uncomfortably under Holmes' piercing gaze. "Mr. Fenwick," he continued, "you have attempted to manipulate both environment and perception, creating the illusion of intrusion, disorder, and inevitability. You believed yourselves unseen, your methods invisible, yet each gesture has been carefully observed and analyzed. Your meticulous planning has, ironically, led to your own exposure. I observed, as always, the precision with which Holmes reconstructed the sequence of events. Watson," he said, gesturing for me to take notes in my mind as he spoke, "the candle in the locked study, a pivotal element, was extinguished not by ordinary accident, nor by mechanical device, but by the deliberate application of a subtle chemical agent. This agent, invisible and odorless, accelerated combustion and extinguished the flame in a precise interval, matching the period during which Miss Wentworth was absent from the room." Miss Wentworth, who had remained quiet, gasped slightly. "A chemical? But how?" Holmes' eyes met hers with his characteristic intensity. The objective was deception. The appearance of natural death, combined with the illusion of a locked room, created the impression of impossibility. And yet, as we observed, the faint traces upon the candle holder, the soot along the window pane, and the subtle indentation upon the floor revealed the sequence of manipulation. Mr. Thorne's death, though tragic, was orchestrated to draw attention away from the true purpose. Misdirection and concealment of motive. He then moved to the library, gesturing at the disarrayed papers. The rifling here was deliberate, yet superficial. No document of value was removed, but the impression of intrusion was sufficient to alarm the household, creating uncertainty and fear. The minor disturbances in the cabinet and ventilation grate served a similar purpose: to amplify tension and to guide our attention toward the wrong locations, while the true methods and intent remained obscured. Lestrade, brow furrowed, interjected, "And Fenwick? What motive could he have for such a complex scheme?" Holmes, without hesitation, explained, "Motives are often intertwined with opportunity and temperament. Mr. Fenwick, ambitious, and convinced of his intellectual superiority, sought to obtain knowledge contained within Mr. Thorne's private correspondence letters that, while apparently trivial, contained information capable of influencing family inheritance and social positioning. His methods, elaborate as they were, reveal both cunning and overreach. Meticulous planning combined with the human frailty of overconfidence. Fenwick, pale and silent, could do little more than nod, his previous assurance replaced by the stark comprehension of exposure." Holmes continued, detailing the precise sequence. The manipulation of the candle, the timing of Miss Wentworth's absence, the calculated disturbances in the library, and the psychological triggers designed to exploit expectation. Each clue, once isolated, now connected seamlessly with the others, revealing a single coherent design. "The pattern," Holmes said, turning to all present, "is as follows. The death in the locked room was engineered to appear natural. Minor intrusions were staged to guide suspicion. Subtle tampering with ordinary objects misdirected attention. And psychological pressure was applied to elicit predictable responses. In short, every act has a dual purpose: conceal the truth and reveal it to those capable of perceiving subtlety. And it is in this very duality that the criminal's undoing lay." I could scarcely keep pace with his reasoning, so intricate and precise was the reconstruction. Yet even as Holmes laid bare the elaborate machinations, I marveled at his ability to perceive the human mind in its complexity. Expectation, error, and overconfidence revealed as clearly as fingerprints on wax. Finally, he turned to the assembled company, his voice calm yet imbued with quiet authority. "Gentlemen, ladies, the case is complete. The locked room was no mystery, the disturbances no mere coincidence, and the perpetrator's identity no longer obscured by misdirection. Every clue has been accounted for, every step explained, and the seemingly impossible rendered comprehensible by patient observation and reasoning." Pembroke, visibly relieved, allowed a breath he had been holding to escape. Holmes inclined his head modestly. "It is the work of careful observation and deduction, sir. Nothing more. The human mind, when observed with patience, reveals both method and motive. Our role is merely to discern, to interpret, and to guide justice to its conclusion." As we left Pembroke Hall that evening, the last light of day fading behind a veil of fog, I reflected upon the extraordinary unfolding of the case. A valet dead in a locked room, disturbances designed to mislead, and an adversary who, though clever, had left himself vulnerable to meticulous observation. Each element had contributed to a resolution as precise as it was inevitable. Holmes, walking ahead with his usual inscrutable calm, had once again demonstrated the power of intellect over circumstance, patience over impulse, and reason over misdirection. The streets of London, grey and sodden with drizzle, seemed somehow less oppressive in the wake of clarity. For once the fog seemed to lift not merely from the city, but from the tangled web of uncertainty that had enveloped Pembroke Hall. And yet, I knew that in the mind of Sherlock Holmes, the work was never truly complete. Every case a new challenge, every mystery a fresh opportunity to illuminate the hidden patterns of human action. The days following the revelation at Pembroke Hall were curiously subdued, as though the estate itself was exhaling after the tension of recent events. London, with its ever-present fog and ceaseless bustle, seemed almost indifferent to the resolution of the intricacies that had so occupied Holmes' Mindan mine. Yet within the walls of Baker Street there lingered a quiet intensity, the afterglow of reasoning brought to completion, and the satisfaction of intellect exercised to its fullest. Holmes, as always, had returned to his habitual routine. The morning found him in his armchair by the window, pipe in hand, fingers tapping lightly upon the rim of the bowl, eyes fixed not upon the passing pedestrians but upon some invisible landscape of thought. I, conversely, took to chronicling the events, determined to capture the details while they remained vivid in memory, lest the extraordinary subtleties of the case fade with time. "Watson," Holmes said without turning, "the resolution of a case is not merely the identification of the culprit, nor the restoration of order. It is, in truth, the illumination of hidden mechanisms, the interplay of human behavior, motive, and circumstance. The facts themselves are insufficient. It is the interpretation that converts mere events into understanding." I nodded, recalling the precise sequence we had observed. The locked room, the extinguished candle, the carefully staged disturbances, and the psychological misdirection that had guided Fenwick's every step. "It is remarkable," I said, "that a mind so deliberate in action could leave yet small enough traces for you to discern." Holmes allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his lips. "Remarkable indeed, Watson. But consider, no matter how careful the hand, human fallibility cannot be entirely overcome. The criminal's confidence is invariably his undoing. Small traces, subtle errors, the unconscious habits of thought, these are what allow insight to triumph over cunning." News from Pembroke Hall had been reassuring. Fenwick, though initially defiant, had admitted his transgressions fully once the evidence was undeniable. The authorities, guided by Holmes' meticulous reconstruction, ensured that justice was served not only for the death of the valet, Mr. Thorne, but also in safeguarding the estate and the peace of its occupants. Mr. Pembroke himself had expressed profound gratitude, yet he remained keenly aware of how narrowly the truth had avoided being obscured by misdirection and fear. Miss Wentworth, for her part, bore a quiet resilience. Her courage in observing the subtle cues within the house, her discretion in remaining an unobserved witness, had been essential to the ultimate unraveling of the mystery. I found her presence a quiet reassurance amid the intellectual turbulence that had dominated our days. Holmes, naturally, offered no overt commendation, yet I detected the faintest acknowledgement of her indispensable role in the proceedings. As the week progressed, our routine at Baker Street resumed a semblance of normalcy, though the memory of the case lingered palpably in the air. Holmes resumed his experiments, his chemical assays, and the occasional violin interlude, while I continued my attempts to render our adventures into words fit for both posterity and understanding. Yet, even amid these familiar activities, there was a sense that the mind of Holmes remained partially elsewhere, ever attuned to the faintest irregularity, the smallest deviation from expectation that might hint at the next mystery. One evening, as I sat by the fire writing notes, Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe aglow, and spoke with deliberate calm. "Watson, cases such as the one at Pembroke Hall remind us that human action is rarely straightforward. Even a seemingly minor incident, a misplaced letter, a faint smell, the slightest displacement of an object can conceal great significance. Observation and deduction must be continuous, vigilant, and nuanced." I paused, pen in hand, reflecting on the truth of his words. "And yet, Holmes, it is the human element, the unpredictability of character, that complicates matters most. Fenwick, despite his careful calculations, underestimated the insight and patience of observation." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Precisely. Confidence, overreach, and the assumption of invisibility are the greatest weaknesses of the mind that believes itself superior. They provide the opening through which deduction, meticulous and patient, may penetrate. It is not merely logic that prevails, Watson, but the combination of logic and an understanding of human nature." The following morning, a letter arrived from Mr. Pembroke, expressing gratitude for our service and detailing the measures he had taken to ensure the estate's security. Holmes read it quietly, a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Watson," he said, "observe how human affairs, once clarified, tend toward equilibrium. The resolution of uncertainty restores not merely order but perspective. Yet every case leaves behind the echo of its lessons." I nodded, understanding that the echo he referred to was both the intellectual challenge and the moral reflection inherent in our work. The intricacies of misdirection, the careful orchestration of both physical and psychological elements, and the ultimate triumph of reasoning over deception had all been instructive, if sobering. Before retiring that evening, Holmes stood by the window, gazing into the foggy streets of London. "Watson," he said quietly, almost to himself, "the city is a vast labyrinth of intention and action. Each corner, each alley, each gaslit street conceals possibilities for observation, deduction, and understanding. We have merely illuminated one small corner. Yet even in this, the mind is both guided and tested." I felt a quiet admiration, mingled with a profound sense of humility. To observe Holmes at work was to witness intellect applied with extraordinary rigor, tempered with patience and insight, and always accompanied by an unerring understanding of the human character. And in that observation I was reminded that the mind, though capable of remarkable deduction, remains a servant to both patience and perception. As the lamp cast its warm glow across Baker Street, I reflected upon the events that had transpired: the valet's death, the library disturbances, the intricate web of misdirection, and the eventual exposure of Harold Fenwick. Each element to be a test, a puzzle, and a testament to the power of observation. And in the quiet satisfaction of understanding, I recognized the enduring lesson of our profession, that even amidst the shadows of uncertainty, reason and vigilance, when applied with patience and insight, will ultimately illuminate truth. Holmes, reclining once more with pipe in hand, glanced toward me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Watson," he said, voice calm and philosophical, "the game is never truly over. Each resolution is but a preparation for the next challenge. Observe keenly, think deliberately, and the mind will remain ever vigilant." I nodded, aware that though one case had concluded, the adventure of intellect, observation, and moral reasoning would continue, as inexorably as the fog that crept along the streets of London. The morning after the resolution at Pembroke Hall dawned grey and contemplative, the city wrapped in its customary fog, and yet London seemed quieter somehow, as if the tumult of a single mystery had left an echo that lingered in the streets. Holmes, as was his custom, was already awake and seated near the window, his gaze fixed not on the passing hansom cabs or gas lamps, but on the distant, shadowed rooftops of the city. I observed him quietly, reflecting upon the extraordinary events that had unfolded over the preceding days, and the still unfolding consequences of reason applied with relentless precision. "Watson," he said at last, his voice calm yet imbued with subtle gravitas, "it is one thing to observe, deduce, and expose a single act of deception. It is another to perceive the framework upon which deception is constructed, the motives, the expectations, and the vulnerabilities that shape human behavior. The criminal at Pembroke Hall, though clever, deliberate, and confident, was constrained by his own assumptions, and it is precisely these assumptions that yielded his undoing." I sat beside him, eager to absorb his reflections. "It is remarkable, Holmes, how the smallest traces, an indentation in the floor, a smudge of soot, a subtle scratch upon a lock, could reveal so much about intent, method, and even character." Holmes' eyes glimmered. "Indeed, Watson, the world is full of minutiae that escape casual notice, yet these minutiae are the language of reality. To observe without prejudice, to analyze without presumption, and to anticipate without expectation, this is the art of deduction. And yet, even in this art, human fallibility is ever present, both in those we observe and in ourselves. Vigilance is eternal, for the mind is easily misled when complacency prevails." I reflected on his words, considering not only the intricate machinations of Harold Fenwick, but also the subtle misdirections and psychological manipulations that had tested even the most meticulous observers. Holmes' ability to perceive and interpret these elements was extraordinary, and yet his reflections carried a philosophical depth that extended beyond the mere resolution of crime. "Holmes," I ventured, "do you not tire of this constant vigilance? The ceaseless scrutiny of human behavior, the endless anticipation of motive and misdirection, surely it must weigh upon you." He smiled faintly, a rare expression that seemed almost at odds with his austere composure. "On the contrary, Watson, the mind is invigorated by challenge, sharpened by complexity, and satisfied only by comprehension. It is not merely the act of solving a puzzle that sustains one, but the process, the observation, the reasoning, the anticipation. and the understanding of human nature that accompanies it. There is a certain beauty in the alignment of logic with human behavior, even when that behavior is flawed or misguided. I nodded thoughtfully, recognizing in his words a lesson that extended beyond the particulars of the case. The events at Pembroke Hall had been dramatic indeed, yet they were also illustrative of a broader truth. That human action is rarely arbitrary, and that observation, when disciplined and patient, could illuminate even the most convoluted sequences of intention and consequence. Holmes rose and moved to the table, selecting his violin and drawing the bow across the strings with a gentle, almost meditative touch. The music, soft yet precise, filled the room, blending with the muted sounds of London beyond the fogged windows. "Watson," he said, resuming his seat, "consider the broader implications of the Pembroke Hall affair. Fenwick's actions were guided by overconfidence, impatience, and the illusion of invisibility. These traits are, in truth, universal vulnerabilities. Every human mind, when confronted with opportunity and temptation, is subject to similar weaknesses. Our task, therefore, is not merely to solve isolated mysteries, but to understand the mechanisms by which human behavior unfolds." I observed him, the intensity of his eyes softened by reflection, and I realized that his philosophy extended beyond crime-solving. It encompassed a broader understanding of morality, choice, and consequence. "So it is not merely the criminal you study, Holmes," I said softly, "but the human condition itself." "Precisely, Watson," he replied, nodding once. "Crime is, in a sense, an amplified study of human nature. It exposes ambition, fear, error, and ingenuity in concentrated form. And yet, the principles revealed: observation, deduction, patience, understanding are applicable to all spheres of life. To understand the mind is to perceive both danger and opportunity, deception and truth." As the day progressed, we spent hours discussing the case in detail. Holmes revisited the pivotal points: the locked study and the extinguished candle, the minor disturbances designed to mislead, the subtle traces that had exposed Fenwick's method, and the psychological anticipation that had guided every observation and counteraction. Each element, when examined carefully, revealed not only the mechanics of the crime, but also the vulnerabilities of human judgment and the enduring value of reason applied without prejudice. "Watson," he said finally, setting aside his violin and leaning back in his chair, "the ultimate lesson of Pembroke Hall is simple yet profound. Opportunity, intellect, and oversight can conceal truth, but they cannot obliterate it. Subtlety may mask intention, and overconfidence may create misdirection, yet patience, observation, and disciplined reasoning will, in time, illuminate reality. This is the enduring principle of our profession, and the reason why mysteries, no matter how cunningly constructed, may ultimately be resolved." I listened, aware that his reflections were as much a meditation on life as they were on crime. Holmes, for all his detachment and precision, seemed attuned to the moral and psychological dimensions of the human experience, and it was in this attunement that his brilliance was most profound. As evening fell and the lamps of Baker Street cast their warm glow across the familiar rooms, I found myself both grateful and humbled. Grateful for the extraordinary clarity that Holmes' intellect had brought to a case that seemed at first incomprehensible, and humbled by the realization that human behavior, in all its complexity, is governed as much by expectation, habit, and perception as by deliberate action. Holmes, reclined once more with his pipe in hand, glanced toward me with that familiar, inscrutable expression. "Watson," he said softly, "each resolved case is a lesson, each observed error a revelation, and though one may rest for a moment, the mind must remain vigilant, for the game is never truly over. There will always be the next mystery, the next human subtlety, and the next opportunity for reason to triumph over deception." I nodded, pen still in hand, understanding that the lessons of Pembroke Hall would endure not merely in the solution of a particular crime, but in the ongoing study of human nature, observation, and deduction. And as I watched Holmes, lost in thought yet perpetually alert, I realized that the adventure of intellect, morality, and insight was far from concluded. The city of London, though ever bustling and cloaked in its habitual fog, seemed to me on that evening peculiarly still. Perhaps it was the weight of the Pembroke Hall affair, or the lingering impressions of meticulous calculation, but there was a quiet as if the world paused to breathe after the revelation of a labyrinthine mystery. Holmes and I had returned to Baker Street, the night settling around us with a cold clarity, and yet the rooms felt warm with the glow of accomplishment and reflection. Holmes, seated in his accustomed chair, pipe alight and eyes half-closed, seemed almost contemplative in a manner rarely afforded to his otherwise restless mind. I, notebook in hand, sought to capture the final impressions, the moral and intellectual echoes of the case, before they too were obscured by the passage of days. "Watson," Holmes began, in that calm yet deliberate tone which always preceded profound insight, "the resolution of the Pembroke Hall affair is complete, yet its lessons extend beyond the mere exposure of a criminal. Observe the intricacies of deception, the manipulation of expectation, and the subtleties of human behavior. These are not anomalies but constants. Each human mind, in action or in error, leaves a trace, however minute, and it is the duty of observation to discern the pattern." I reflected upon the long sequence of events, the valet in the locked study, the disturbances of the library and cabinet, the tampering of the ventilation grate, and the ultimate psychological trap that drew Fenwick into the open. Every act had seemed independent, yet Holmes had demonstrated, with his characteristic precision, that nothing occurred by accident. Even misdirection, carefully orchestrated, bore within it the faintest signature of truth. "Holmes," I said, unable to conceal both admiration and curiosity, "the subtlety with which you constructed the psychological trap allowing Fenwick to act, observe, and reveal himself was extraordinary. But do you not tire of such intellectual exertions, especially when deception can be so elaborate?" Holmes allowed a faint smile. "On the contrary, Watson, the mind is invigorated by challenge, sharpened by complexity. Every misdirection, every subtle manipulation is an opportunity to observe, deduce, and understand. And it is in the understanding of human nature, as much as in the application of logic, that resolution is achieved. The criminal, confident in his intellect, is ever vulnerable to the patient observation of a mind attuned to both detail and psychology." I pored over my notes from Pembroke Hall, attempting to reconcile the intricate orchestration with the simplicity of moral outcome. Fenwick, for all his cleverness, had been undone not by force, but by overconfidence and predictable human tendencies. Holmes had anticipated every step, turning apparent chaos into a revelation of method, motive, and opportunity. The brilliance of his reasoning lay not merely in solving a puzzle, but in revealing the patterns that govern human conduct. Holmes, noticing my contemplation, spoke again. "Watson, remember this. The study of crime is, in essence, the study of life in microcosm. Ambition, fear, error, and ingenuity are magnified, yet they are no less human than the ordinary actions of daily existence. To observe is to perceive both the extraordinary and the mundane, and to discern the invisible threads that connect them." As the night deepened, we sat in the quiet of Baker Street, the fog pressing softly against the windows, the glow of the lamps casting long shadows across familiar furniture. The case at Pembroke Hall had concluded, the criminal brought to justice, and the estate secured. Yet the satisfaction of resolution was tempered by an awareness of the persistent challenges that awaited, the inexhaustible complexity of human nature, the infinite potential for misdirection, and the ceaseless demand for observation and reasoning. "Holmes," I said finally, "do you anticipate the next mystery with the same intensity, or does the conclusion of one bring a measure of repose?" He inclined his head slowly, eyes fixed upon the dimly lit street. "Repose, Watson, is fleeting. The mind of a detective is ever alert, for there are always anomalies, inconsistencies, and the faintest disturbances that demand scrutiny. The game is never truly over. Yet there is satisfaction in the knowledge that reason and observation, applied patiently and thoroughly, will ultimately reveal truth where chaos seems supreme." I marveled at the serenity with which he regarded the world, a mind forever restless yet grounded in logic, patient yet ever alert, detached yet deeply engaged with human nature. There was a moral dimension in Holmes' approach, a recognition that understanding is both a shield and a tool, that observation is both a duty and an art, and that even the most cunning deception bears the marks of human limitation. The night waned, and at last Holmes rose, placing his pipe upon the mantelpiece. "Watson," he said, voice quiet, "we shall rest for now, but remain vigilant. Each case leaves lessons, each observation extends understanding. and the city itself remains an inexhaustible laboratory of human behavior. Pembroke Hall has been illuminated, yet beyond its walls, the shadows of uncertainty persist. There will always be another challenge, another puzzle, and the opportunity to exercise reason and insight. I nodded, fully aware that though one adventure had concluded, the life of observation, deduction, and moral reflection was unending. Holmes' work was both a study of intellect and a meditation on the human condition, and I felt privileged to witness, chronicle, and partake in it. As I extinguished my lamp and prepared for the night, the streets of London remained cloaked in fog, mysterious yet familiar, indifferent yet full of possibility. Within Baker Street, calm prevailed, the glow of reasoning and reflection warming the room. Holmes reclined once more, eyes half closed, yet alert, a silent sentinel to the patterns that govern human life and the intricate, sometimes treacherous, but always fascinating labyrinth of human action. And so the case of the candle in the locked room came to its conclusion, not with drama, nor with spectacle, but with the quiet triumph of observation, deduction, and moral insight. The criminal was exposed, justice restored, and the lessons of patience, vigilance, and understanding etched indelibly into memory. And as always, I remained in awe of Sherlock Holmes, whose intellect and insight continue to illuminate the darkest recesses of human endeavor, leaving both mystery and understanding in their wake.